Good morning and welcome. This is American Vineyard Live. Today we have Stetcyn Maldonado and Tom Johnson of Project Apis M to discuss soil health and what weeds can tell you about what's going on underneath your vineyard. Just a couple of announcements. As usual on this webcast, there will be two prize winners announced at the end of the event. One lucky winner will receive a brand new Baco pruning tool set, and the other, a $100 Amazon gift card. Special shout out to Baco Pruning Tools and Ag Biofusion for helping make this event possible. If you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, text the number below the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. Now, let's get right into it. Stetcyn, we've learned a lot from you as a contributing writer to American Vineyard. Tell us a little bit about how your journey in cover crops began, and in soil health especially.
Just stumbled into it. I didn't grow up in agriculture. I just always loved plants. And when I started going to college, I was trying to take any class that I could. I was going to a community college. I was just trying to see what I enjoyed, and I tumbled into agriculture. And then I actually ended up into farming and using cover crops because of a birthday present. I was trying to find a job in my studies, and a friend of mine came over and he said, "Here's this business card. I put in a good word for you. If you go and call him, he might give you a job." And that actually turned into two jobs. First, I was a farm manager. I managed a couple hundred acres of almonds and walnuts. And then after walnuts crashed, I ended up working as a salesman. And my old boss called me up, and he used to be the manager for Seeds for Bees. And he's like, "Hey, you want to switch jobs and come over to Seeds for Bees?" And I said, "Absolutely, count me in." And now I manage the program. So
Oh,
that's
wonderful.
how I started using cover crops, and now I give cover crops away for free.
Very
So
nice, very nice. And Tom, thank you for joining us as well. What can you share with us about your journey and your research and how it brought you to where you are today?
well, I was brought up in agriculture. I grew up in a vineyard outside of Fresno. So my childhood was pulling weeds and walking up and down rows. It was just kind of a natural to major in agriculture in college and came out with basic degrees in crop improvement and plant physiology. And cover cropping 30 something years ago was still kind of avant garde, but it was like, I want to try this. I was first went to work for a company on the west side, and they had dead dirt. It wouldn't even grow weeds. So by the time that job was over with, I at least got weeds to grow in that field. So that was kind of my introduction to soil health and using cover crops and using biomass to make a difference on that. So then I went to work. After that one, I worked for about a year managing an operation in Madera. And after that, I went to work for Camp Rouse Seed Company in Manteca, which was a wholesale cover crop seed supplier. So we did cover crop seed, pasture seed, a little bit of lawn and turf, and corn seed. And so I did the corn plots in the fall and the spring and chased everything else in between. So I'd been working with cover crops and going to all these field days and going to all these other options and things like that and learning my way along. And it's like it just kind of clicks as you go along. So some people call me the whisperer, or some people call me a guru, but I just have been dealing with cover crop for a long time.
Yeah, and I want to say that this morning when we were talking and reviewing about the webcast a little bit, one thing that I think both of you were excited about was talking about anything in dirt and anything with roots. So look forward to sharing more with you guys. So I wanted to ask, Stetcyn actually has been a contributing writer for American Vineyard and Pacific Nut Producer for a little while now. And I was really intrigued by your discussion on how weeds can be a sort of litmus test for your soil health and other conditions as well. You touched on how everything is the way it is for a reason. Stetson first, and then Tom, give us some background on that.
Yeah, at first it really came to me because I'm an avid hiker. I love nature. I love going out in the woods. I also love farms and I love my own garden. And eventually it just struck me that everything exists because there is a reason in that location that makes it possible. Like there's a reason why I don't have a redwood in my backyard because there's just not enough water. There's for the same reason why I don't have a bunch of wildflowers like up on Table Mountain, if you guys are familiar with it, because of the rain and the shallow soils. And it made me realize that we have so much control over our agriculture systems, and both by changing the systems and changing what's affecting our farms, a lot of what we are struggling with is there because of something we are doing or something that we're not doing. And weeds can really show you or tell you what's going on with your soil, and maybe they may give you a hint on how to get rid of them easier. How about you, Tom?
Oh yeah, kind of along the same lines. Basically, there's a saying. Basically, the agronomist looks at the ground because that's what the trees are rooted in, and the grower's looking up in the trees. So I'm always looking at the ground and what's growing there and what's not. And it takes a while, kind of, to get that. We have an overabundance of this particular weed, and scratching your head and going, why? Until you look around a little bit more. And I always called it forensic agronomy. It was like, why is it that way? Why is it doing that? So sometimes it's easy to determine that. Sometimes it's like, yeah, you got to do a little more digging. And as you worked with in agriculture and you were working with the not the really prescriptive stuff per se, but you would learn. One, you had to learn all the weeds. My major professor was the weed scientist at college, so I always got joked about growing weeds, but that's another story. But you look at the weeds and you learn what they'll grow, where they grow well, and then when they're not there, and it's like, well, that should be here. What's going on? So that's kind of what you're looking at, and then and you learn something all the time. It's like, never knew those sprouted only in the spring, but a lot of times you just got to stop and think about what happened recently versus what has happened over time and that type of thing. So you'll notice weeds one spring that you hadn't seen in 3 years, and you stop to think about it. It's like, oh, that's right. It rained a little later this year, so we had a late rain to make things sprout. That's why that's showing up this year. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
lot of observation, a lot of remembering what you saw, and then trying to tie it all together.
Yeah, so paying close attention to what's going on in the vineyard will really help you understand what to expect. Yeah. So that actually leads us into an interesting question that we got from one of our viewers a couple days ago when they registered. Um, the question was, I've recently heard it said that weeds should truly be called an indicator species in terms of providing information regarding soil health. In that light, isn't the eradication of weeds deleterious to understanding what's really going on with our soil? Why should some weeds be controlled and others eradicated?
As far as controlling and eradication, it's really hard to eradicate something. It's easier to control something. I wouldn't put in the money and the effort to eradicate something unless it's a serious issue, kind of like witches broom in a tomato field. I would try to eradicate that. But if it's something like mallow or little mallow, you're not going to be able to get rid of it. But it does tell you about what your soil is up to. I wouldn't advocate for not controlling your weeds because you have to make money off of your crop, and weeds can interfere with that. But giving yourself the permission to take the time and to slow down and see what's in your field, identify what it is, what kind of growing structure does it have, when is it growing, its life cycle will really show you a lot about what's going on in your field. Um, Kinda like I struggled a lot with mallow because I was dealing with a lot of compacted soils and not a lot of competition with it early in the spring. So mallow is really aggressive. It has a great taproot. It can really survive hot temperatures with little water, especially if you can get ahead of things like the grasses, which is how I had some really spectacular mallow plants in my fields. But it was just really showing that the soil there was so compacted that nothing else could compete with it. And largely when it comes to cover crops, which is my background, you're looking at competing with something, and I would use that as a goal to preserve my finances and also the efficacy of my herbicides.
Yeah, and weeds are so successful because they are a tremendous producer of seed most of the time. So they'll some shed their seed very early. That's why they become dominant. Others have hard seed that will survive in the soil for years. Others just make bazillions of seeds and reproduce themselves that way. So you're not necessarily going to eradicate it. You can get it down to a controlled level. In a vineyard, where you need to do the most weed control is basically going to be on the berm under the vines. The middles, there is, if it's drip irrigated only, 98% of your roots are going to be within that drip watered zone. There's going to be a few that reach out there, but not as many. So that competition in the middles is going to be different than if you had just solid problems under your vines, basically, because then it's competing for water and fertility and whatever else you're putting through that drip system or applying to it. So that's another one. It's like, okay, well, if I can keep the berm clean or clear, I can live with some of this stuff in the middle, unless, of course, it's prickly, trip and fall hazard, various other things like that, and then you're evaluating that as you go along. Um, in other in other operations, other types of agriculture, in row crops or open ground, yeah, weeds are a big competitor for light and resources and everything else. So that's why you need to control them more so than in perennial crops. But you'll see a shift when you shift your cultural practices. If you were cultivating and clean cultivating for years and then you kind of shift over and say, I'm not going to do that anymore, that's when you can start building your compaction that you unintentionally. And then mallow or malva, whatever you want to call it, cheeseweed, whatever you want to call it, it likes to be mowed. It's got a crown down close to the ground. So it's also identifying your enemy. How does it grow back? Does it grow from right down at the soil level? In other words, you need to dig it out to get it to go away, or can I knock the tops off and it'll be good? So that goes into that weed identification and strategizing how I'm going to deal with it, and then
Yeah,
using it.
so essentially the goal is not so much to eradicate, but control the weeds that are the most important to keep in control, and not worry about the ones that are just there, like in the middle of the row. If they're
Yeah, I
not
mean,
causing any problems, then why throw in the money and the time to deal with it?
yeah. So that's and then along the dang it, I lost it. Along the soil health side of that, basically, is that having living roots in the ground is better than not. As long as you can. Keeping the soil covered is another one of the pillars of the soil health regenerative type of thinking. Keep the soil covered, keep it cooler. So yeah, I mean, dead weeds laying on top of the ground, or even little short kind of live ones, isn't that bad a thing, because bare soil, yeah, you needed it for laying paper trays down, but on the other hand, those guys would use a winter cover crop versus letting the weeds grow in the summer, from my memory anyway. So it was, it's what's your ultimate goal out of this thing? Yeah, you can't get people to come pick your grapes if they're just filled with horseweed and fleabane and what have you growing up underneath of them. So you do need to control that, but you could live with those in the middle because you can mow them off or push them down or even disc them up.
Mhm. Yeah, and that said, let's say that our growers became really, really good at reading the weeds in their vineyards. Um, how would that benefit them? What would that look like? What would their vineyards look like?
Every vineyard would look different according to what the grower needs most, and it will change depending on location. So something in the Napa Valley is going to look different than Lodi. Um, I think it'd be harder to see it, but I think, in my opinion, it'd be a better use of their finances, is what they'd be seeing, because they'll be able to target what their main issues are with more precision and be able to throw more controlled measures at it than just a single choice. for instance, there's a lot of dry farm vineyardists, and they have to till their soil a little bit just to try to kill everything. If they had something like bindweed, that bindweed is going to be really, really grateful for all that tillage because they're going to be spreading those roots and it's going to be growing throughout the vineyard. So finding a way to reduce tillage and not be spreading those rhizomes would be a good way to deal with bindweed compared to other plants. If you have a lot of severe compaction, like with horseweed and hairy fleabane, finding a way to reduce that compaction and let it get outcompeted would be a different version. So those both of those would look very different physically. Um, what are your thoughts, Tom?
I would really I think in a vineyard I'd really prefer to have something I know what the heck it is, what it's going to do. In other words, a planted cover crop. Yeah, you're going to have weeds in it no matter what. Um, but basically, reducing that tillage is going to help in the long run for vine health, um, and soil health, basically. So a not low tillage or no tillage and mowed centers type of operation would work in a lot of things, especially now as most of them are drip irrigated, except for the very few drylanders that are out there. And the drylanders, that was done for a reason. Yeah, you wanted to limit how much water those weeds would suck up. And by cultivating that soil, you built a cap that no more lower moisture could evaporate through. That set in the Napa and Sonoma valleys, that sets you up for that's where the mustard is so prevalent. That seed's up in that now just up beat up zone right there. And the first time it rains, it says, "Oh boy," and away I go, and it gets ahead of everything. As people shifted away from cultivating so cleanly and everything, the amount of mustard out there slowly started to decline, and they started going, "Where'd my mustard go?" And it's like, well, you shifted over to this. So, it's a consequence of weed control, and it's like, okay, so you're trying to find that balance between weeds out there or plant growth out there, and um, maximizing basically your yield or your sellable product. Um, Dead weeds are not going to compete for water, but if you got a leak in your drip system, you're going to find it because it's green out there, type of thing. So I'm kind of advocate for not necessarily disking it and keeping it as clean as possible.
Mm.
You know,
So you'd be an advocate for mowing versus tilling, right? Am I understanding? Tell us a
yeah,
little more
yeah.
about that.
I would say mow or top growth control is a better option than clean tillage, which I think's not necessarily fully adopted, but pretty close from my observation out there. I mean, in table grapes and so on and so forth down south, they might have whatever grows in the wintertime, whether they planted it or whatever grew, and they mow it and drive on it all summer. Works for them. That was the way we did the wine grapes in Madeira. Up in the Sonoma Valley, basically, and Sonoma and Napa Valleys, basically, they do till it in the spring, but then they don't till it anymore. So they'll till it once just to turn their cover crop in, and then they'll kind of put it to bed for the summer. And you get some weeds coming up out there. It's not that big a deal.
So it was that early control that was important for them.
Yeah, yeah. And that actually probably has something to do with the weed spectrum that they have. If you go out and control it early, you're gonna limit the weed seed ability also.
So that said, wonder what does it, that leads me to ask the questions. What are some serious tells for? And you touched on this a little bit, but what are the tells for highly compacted soil? What weeds are going to be thriving under those conditions? And to ask an additional question there, um, what should be done about it? So, once again, what does highly compacted soil look like? What weeds are going to thrive, and what should be done?
Tom, do you want to go first?
I'll give it a whirl here. Highly compacted soils, and it's going to depend on your soil type. Sandy loams and sands that are highly compacted are usually probably going to support more spring sprouted stuff, like fleabane, or they're going to support fall sprouted, very early maturing annual grasses for the most part, like foxtails. Um, there are some changes, differences, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the rule doesn't always apply. I was digging through all this fun stuff, and most of the time, if you had a broadleaf weed issue out there, that's indicating good drainage. But there's a couple of broadleaves out there that have to have compaction to work. Dandelions for one, plantain for another. They prefer to have compacted soil, but they've got a taproot. That taproot kind of helps go through that. Um, Worrying about how compacted the soil is, I think, would be more a case of how much rainfall you get and how good your infiltration still is, so that that water's not running off. It's soaking in, or at least most of it is. Um, if you had beat it to death, beat your soil to death, and basically turned it into a parking lot out there, that's not helping anything. And the weed, you're going to have a few weeds, but not as good a thick weeds as you could. I'd rather see a good thick weed crop than no weed crop, whether it's got shallow fiber roots or it's got a deep tap root, because that is an upset and makes a niche for something to come in and find its home.
Mm.
Noticed within compacted soils where you're not getting a lot of water infiltration, there's a lot more grasses. Would you say the same, Tom?
Yeah, yeah, you're going to see grass more often than you're going to see a broadleaf in a compacted soil, mostly because the compaction layer is usually not right at the surface. It's anywhere from 6 to 12 inches down. Well, that zone right there lets all that fibrous root system spread out, capture everything before it gets down to the compaction layer, and it'll makes that grasses flourish versus the taprooted ones. Fixing that, maybe using a cover crop that has a taproot system and forcing that change in that. So going out there and putting in radishes or mustard or something like that, or to some extent, some small grains have a really good root system on them to help go through compaction layers as well. That would be um, things to consider. If, like, okay, I noticed that, yeah, I haven't done anything to that field for a while, and I'm starting to get a lot of foxtails. I'm starting to get a lot of annual bluegrass, things that are got real shallow roots, but lots of them. It's time to go out there with the probe and see if I'm running into a compaction layer, and then it's like, okay, I can address that without having to do mechanical ripping if I don't want to. But the cover crop's not going to fix it; it's just going to help.
Yeah, it's really hard to get rid of things like plow pans in a perennial situation, which is why we do talk about cover crops. If your vineyard's already planted and you're struggling with compaction, then I would definitely suggest a cover crop. If you're prepping a site to be planted and you know you have an issue, maybe I'd look at tillage to try to break up that plow pan. It would really depend on how deep and how thick that compaction layer is. Another thing you can do is try not to drive on your soil when it's wet. That drives a lot of compaction, and it's a lot harder to. It's easier during the wind. What was it? I'm trying to remember. We don't have as much frost as other places in the country, but for countries that do get frost into their soil, it's easier to lift the soil up from compaction than to bring it in sideways, if that makes sense. A really good demonstration of that is the wagon wheels from all the pioneers that crossed the United States. Their trails are still there, even though people aren't traveling by covered wagon anymore and haven't been doing so for many generations. That compaction is still there. Uh, um, so trying to find basically farming your soil is the best thing you could do, and trying to find solutions with the situation you're given. Uh, we've talked a lot about compaction. Tom, you were talking more about weed seed and seasonal changes. Could you talk more about how spring weeds and fall weeds could be affected by the weather and farm techniques?
Yeah, when you're doing your assessment is, okay, what weeds have I got out there? You do need to realize that, when did that sprout? And I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, that the flea bane and thing, kind of the scourge that we're up against right now on some of those things, they sprout in the spring. They sprout in February and March. So if we didn't get any rain in February and March, um, those would be limited. They'd probably still come up, but they'd be more limited than they are. And that has to do with soil temperature and air temperature when that's happening right there. So I kind of divide them up. I got the spring sprouters or the spring and warm season growers. A lot of our perennial problems are summer or warm season growing materials like bindweed, Johnson grass, Bermuda grass, um, not green foxtail, not necessarily hair barley. And then we have the fall stuff. Well, it comes up with when it can come up with under cooler soil temperatures, shorter day length, things like that, and um, you'll have those show up, and that's kind of what's in our annual range per se. So a lot of times, if I I'm like Stetson, I look out the window when I'm driving down the road here, and it's like, okay, you're always watching what's outside of where you're at because you're in a vineyard. That's a modified environment. That's not necessarily what you're up against. So if you're in Amador County and you happen to be driving through there, and you notice that everything's turning brown, and you look out there, and it's like, okay, everything's drying up. You know that the vineyard's starting to get to that point as well. And what showed up the best this year. And the weeds and the weed seeding ability is usually a real good indicator of things that have happened in the past. And a lot of vineyards are put on basically former range ground. So if it was overgrazed for years or whatever, that's compaction. That's also selection. The desirable stuff was selected out because it was desirable to eat or burned off or whatever, and the less desirable is now being more predominant. So that's why it may blow in on you, and you all of a sudden it's like, why have I got foxtails in my vineyard? And it's like, okay, that's what's going on there. But yeah, it's realizing, okay, why? And you always ask, why is that weed there? And it's like, okay, well, that's there because, well, why is that? Because, well, it rained in April this year. Okay, so we're going to see turkey mullein. We're going to see some of those summer and spring sprouters a little thicker than normal than we had during the years when we didn't get very much rain, and it all came in December and January, and then it pretty much stopped. So spring rain has a lot to do with what's going to grow in the summertime. When the fall rain comes, is going to have a little more to do with what's going to be predominant in the cool season stuff. So fall rain, just a little bit is going to be about enough to set the really easy to germinate stuff off and get it growing. If the fall rain was a lot and it comes like it used to in fairly regular intervals and in decent amounts, then everything grows. So rainfall and air temperatures have a lot to do with how well things are going to go.
I think from a management standpoint, a good way to use this info that Tom just shared would be to see what your most problematic weeds are and when are they going to be germinating and finding a way to cut that off. So if they're growing on your berms, on your vines, I would try to get pre-emergence out there before those seeds start to sprout. If it's something that's in the row strips that are really problematic, I would try to get a fast establishing cover crop to take that space up before that weed can fill that space and use up your real estate.
Stetson, how late is too late on the pre-emergent and the getting cover crop established? I mean, a lot of times what activates this is just a good rain. Um,
Yeah, a lot of
we don't
times
always know when
it
it's going to rain. So how late would be too late?
um it depends on the situation, depends on your rains they're coming from. And honestly, I was a bit spoiled as a orchard farmer because I was able to turn on my solid set irrigation and water in that pre-emergent before someone like with a drip system would be able to. I would defer more to that person's PCA and trying to get that pre-emergent activated before the weed seed germinates.
Yeah, it's and anymore because the way the fall rains seem to be working, it's kind of a crapshoot. It's like, we hope it's going to rain at Thanksgiving, so it's like, okay, that might be, we want to get the berms cleaned off, and if you're using a pre-emergent, do that. If you're using an undervine cultivator, you're going to want to do that before that stuff gets very big. The other caveat in weed control was always the smaller they are, the easier they are to kill. Unfortunately, with weird rainfall and what have you, you may have to run that cultivator twice. You may have to go out there early and do it and get that one, and then you may flush. And if we get some more rain, you may flush another set of weeds. So that's an advantage of a pre-emergent herbicide program, is that yeah, I didn't have to do that. I put it on and it kept most of them. It's not going to keep all of them, but I kept most of them from coming up and growing. Um, so that makes the undervine cultivating a little bit tougher. But on the other hand, there's much better machinery out there to do it now than there used to be. So I mean, I remember doing it with a French plow, basically. So it was, you left a little island around the base of the vine, and you had to go out and knock that island down, and then you had to throw all the dirt back eventually. So that's come a long ways. Basically, they have weed badgers. They also have basic things that will mow underneath the vine and just not hurt anything. So it's a decision on what you want to do, but the berm, keeping the berm clear or clean or weeds not very aggressive, is probably the best thing you can do for at least your crop. In the middles, yeah, basically using a cover crop as a weed control technique is, yeah, you're competing for space, resource. You're putting something out there to compete for resources. That's fertility, space, light, water, those type of things. And then you can flip the switch a little bit on that and utilize what you grew to help control something later. And that's a management decision. Is if I just knock it down, it's going to shade the soil and cut down on the spring stuff coming up. It's going the spring sprouters they also have to have light. Seed has to have light basically to also germinate. A lot of those weeds do, at least. So they gotta, if you shade that, it's going to cut down on the amount of that's going to be able to come up. So that's part of what we're getting out of roller crimping in vineyards out there. We're getting that soil protection. We're also getting some weed suppression. But you have to
Yeah,
have
and then
enough.
that actually. Oh, I'm sorry.
No. So
Oh,
you just have to have enough biomass to do the job. That's the only problem.
that's what I was gonna say. I have a farmer who roller crimps to control weeds, and he's telling me that if the cover crop is big enough and like beefy enough, he can actually get away with not having to mow or control his weeds for a couple months. I think the longest was almost 4 months, which sounds amazing to me. Other times, if the cover crop isn't as big, he'd have to come back in and mow and spray within a couple weeks. And a lot of that's tied to how the season, how the climate is that year.
Well, that said, then as far as cover crops go, what are some of the best that you've seen that are able to suppress a lot of the weed species that thrive in compaction or compacted soil? I mean, if a grower has compacted soil, what cover crops would you recommend?
For compacted soils, I'd first look and see what's there living and then try to find something that competes with that life cycle. So if I have a plant that's out there that has a really deep taproot and it's a weed that I'm struggling with, I'm going to try to find something that has a deep taproot. So for controlling things like hairy fleabane and mallow or malva, I'd be using a brassica cover crop. Those brassicas, they establish really quickly, they get big, they get tall, they also have that really deep taproot, so they're competing in the same niche or the same venue as that weed would be competing in. If I have a shallower soil profile and I have a lot of grasses, then I'm going to try to find a grass that would compete with what I have in that area. Um, let's see, Tom, do you think if I had a ryegrass as an issue, planting something like triticale would help with that?
It'll help actually on ryegrass if that was your becoming one of your issues. One of my tools in my toolbox would be, okay, when that ryegrass is pollinating, shedding pollen. In other words, it's got seed heads out and then it's starting to shed pollen. Is then when you would mow it off. Okay, well, it's an annual plant. It says I'm going to make seed. That's my whole job in life, is to make seed. But if you knock that top off and you knock it down low enough, it's got to regrow that whole structure. And grasses, a lot of times, when they've got that seed head up, they're now shifted all their movement of photosynthates into that, pushing it up. They're not pushing it down into the crown and making more growth stuff. So if you can knock the tops off and knock it down hard enough, and a lot of times our dry springs then start to come into play also, because now there's less water down there for that thing to suck up and help it. So it'd be a couple, if you had a bad patch of ryegrass, it'd be probably a few years of, yeah, I got to go mow it off when that, mow it to the stage of the ryegrass, the weed I want to control, not necessarily the stage of the cover crop. So if you, in one scenario, if you had to mow, your cover crop was too big and you needed to mow it, and then the ryegrass comes back up through it, you may have to be mowing again. Otherwise, it's like, okay, you put something like a triticale or barley or something like that in there that's going to be compete for resources with that ryegrass, and you can control it. The rye grains actually do a little bit of allelopathic effect. In other words, the roots and the plant residue exudes a bit of natural herbicide that will also help kind of limit how much grass can grow around it. They don't work against broadleaves, but it works pretty good on other grasses. They found that out with corn. It's like, oh, why is the corn not coming up? It's like, yeah, you had a rye grain cover crop for the last 3 years out there, and you've got this big old thatch of stuff. It's a nuance. It's a very, a very not obvious, but it's a very real thing that works. It's just realizing that, yeah, I got to manage it this particular way if that's what I want to stop. Mustard and ryegrass, or brassica, or whatever you want to call it, would probably not be a real good combination for the mere reason. Yeah, the brassica comes up, it's got a deeper taproot, it's sucking up moisture from below, lower, it shaded that stuff. But on the other hand, ryegrass is a pretty tough one to control. So it's a multi-pronged assault on it, basically. So go out and make sure you're not making more seed if at all possible. And yeah, okay, I had to sacrifice that my cover crop only got 2 foot tall instead of 3 foot tall. But on the other hand, I don't have most of this year's crop of ryegrass seed back on the ground waiting for next year. But you're going to have to take 2 or 3 years to do it. And I won't say you could actually fully control it, but you'll be able to knock it back to where it's a less big problem. And that's a shift from go out and spray it to, yeah, we're going to use mechanical means to try and control seed production and plant growth. I don't know if I explained that one quite right, but there's ways to do that. Basically, is part of it's just doing the physiology of the weed and knowing what's going on with that plant and doing your control measures then.
Yeah, I think some of the key points that we're trying to find here really are what tools can we put in our tool belt for various circumstances and situations that we run into. And so, yeah, so far, I think the discussion has been fantastic. We're gonna take a quick break. Along with using cover crops to improve your soil health and tilling less, there are other options you have as well to improve your soil profile. So we're going to hear from our sponsor, Ag Biofusion, with a quick 30-second snippet video, and then we'll be right back into the discussion.
Ag Biofusion's HB Plus can support plant nutrition, stimulate root development, improve resistance to stress, suppress disease, enhance yield and quality, boost soil biology, improve the soil structure, lower dependence on synthetic fertilizers. HB Plus works great in vineyards. Improve your soil profile and maximize yield today. Contact Ag Biofusion.
Those pecans look good.
Well, thank you so much, Ag Biofusion, for supporting this webcast today. Make sure you reach out to Martine Jeffers after the fact. His contact information is included here. So let's jump right back into the conversation. We've talked a lot about compact soils, like we had mentioned. And I want to go over, Stetcyn, you had talked a little bit about in the article about highly hydrated soils and maybe some of the more marshy type circumstances. You might see a lot of nut sedge and other things. Tell us a little bit about, let's talk about loose soil, and let's talk about other circumstances like alkalinity and high moisture content.
Yeah, so soggy soils can also change what's growing there. So different plants are adapted to different situations. So if you have a lot of water sitting in your soil, you're going to see more water-philic plants or water-loving plants such as nutsedge. You might see reeds out there. Um, my first question seeing those plants out there would be, what is the irrigation system doing? Do I have a leak? Am I over irrigating? Is there a low spot in the farm where water is building up? And trying to mitigate that at first, as opposed to just spraying it and hoping to get rid of it. You might need to improve your drainage. You might need to try to level your soil or inspect your irrigation system and seeing what it's doing. I'm also a big fan of um now I'm trying to think if vineyards can use the pressure chambers. I think they can. But measuring what your plant water stress is looking like and basing your irrigation system off of what your vines are telling you is another good metric for controlling weeds, especially if you're dealing with something that really needs a soggy soil. Basically, finding out why do you have water sitting and why is it not going anywhere.
And you're not going to be able to avoid that sometimes. That and
Mhm.
nutsedge is probably one that you're just going to have a hard time controlling with um, cover cropping or soil non tillage, non whatever, and even tillage even kind of like exasperates the problem because the root structure and the reseeding of nut sedges basically of the little nutlets. Basically, they found that you had needed to almost turn 12 inches of soil completely upside down to bury those nutlets deep enough that they didn't come back. And that's a lot of horsepower and everything else. And that was in open ground stuff. So you're not going to be able to do that in a vineyard. Um, but yeah, over application of water or your application rate's faster than your infiltration rate may be an issue with that type of thing. And you're probably going to, you're and trying to remember the last time I walked through a vineyard and nutsedge was a big problem, and it's also going to be hanging out underneath the vine where you don't have a whole lot of reach with any cultivation to pull it out and do anything with it. And it grows almost all year round. It just doesn't grow very fast in the wintertime, but it grows like gangbusters in the summertime, and that's when we have because we don't get rain. We don't have a whole heck of a lot of stuff that's going to grow that time of the year that we could use as a cover crop or a competitor with that type of stuff. So it's one of those. It's one of those ones that should be on the weed card. That's like, okay, there's a patch of nutsedge down there. One, we're going to figure out why, and two, we're going to try and keep from spreading it, and we're going to keep hammering on it however we can, type of thing. So, usually it's as an indicator of soil health. It's usually an indicator of wet and probably good fertility or over fertility. Some of these other ones basically are also indicators of like, yeah, maybe I need to back off on using legumes in my cover crop or back off on the manure based compost because I probably got more fertility in that ground than those grapes really need. So I'm growing nettle, I'm growing things that like that. So
And
that's how you use those as an indicator. It's like, okay, there's something going on here. What the heck's going on?
yeah, we had one grower that actually, speaking of that, we had one grower that was talking about alkalinity as well. One asked the question a few minutes ago um, uh, on the topic of alkalinity in their soil. If it's high, greater than a pH of 7, what types of weeds will I see? Am I going to see mustard, foxtails, dandelions, others? Over fertility and and alkalinity, what are we seeing there?
I'm trying to remember. I haven't dealt with alkaline soils as much, but I want to say that you'll get more chickweed and chicory. Um, I always forget plantain likes to have some likes it to be either more acidic or alkaline. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this is where researching your weeds and what's in your farm specifically will tell you what's going on. Um, every plant's going to be different. Every farm's going to be different. You might have something that we won't talk about today that's telling you something about your soil. And I would really welcome people to go out and identify it and really learn about what that weed is doing and what it thrives in. What about you, Tom?
On the alkalinity front, my indicator species usually is burr clover or annual medic, whatever you want to call it. That indicates that you're at 7 or a little bit higher. It really kind of prefers that. Alkaline situations a lot of times are in drier climates as well. You'll also see some summer stuff like alkali sida. Um, what else was there? There was a couple of them basically that really kind of like that higher pH soils out there. They also need a little bit of water in the summertime, so they're going to be growing up on the berm type of thing. Mustard doesn't really like anything over about 7.5, as near as I can tell. And anything over about 7, a lot of the legumes are going to struggle a little bit to do much in the way of nitrogen fixation. Um, Peas, especially, don't really like a real high alkaline soil. Barley takes it real well. Triticale does okay. Rye grain does okay. Oats, on the other hand, kind of struggle a little bit. They'll have problems with being able to suck up, get enough fertility to keep them from being yellow for a while in the spring and that type of thing. So if you're if you know you're in a 7.2, 7.5 soil out there, probably the west side of Madera County or whatever, you're going to see a different weed spectrum than the guy in Lodi does. Mostly
So
because
even the success or, oh, sorry, Tom.
then the success of what, and it goes back to what grows there is what grows there for a reason. So soil pH is one of those characteristics in the soil that drives what's going to grow out there or grow well.
So even the success or failure of certain cover crops can be an indicator as well, like the legumes you just mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, the peas don't look real happy. What's going on out there? And you go out and pull them up, and they're not fixating anything, and they didn't grow very happy. They're not very happy about it. That could be soil type, that could be soil alkalinity or soil pH. But the legumes prefer neutral or slightly acid side for the most part.
Now, is there a particular weed that, if it's doing really well, you might consider like a doom weed? For example, if you see this weed, okay, my vineyard is in big trouble. This weed is doing really well right now. Is there anything like that, any species we should be looking out for?
I wouldn't say there's anything that's doom weed when it comes to soil health. However, when it comes to farm management, I say there definitely are a couple, such as Johnson grass under your vines is an absolute nightmare to try to deal with. Other things like field bindweed, that's really hard to get rid of. I've always had beef with hairy fleabane just because I had some Roundup and glyph and Goal resistant hairy fleabane. What about you, Tom? What's your nightmare plants that'll show up in a vineyard?
Well, I'm with you. Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, and the horseweed and the kazanias, basically the fleabanes and the horseweed and things like that. Because what happens is that if they're growing on the berm, basically they're going to interfere with harvest. They're going to interfere with a whole lot of other things. They're also going to harbor a whole bunch of insects that you don't really want in your canopy. So that's why keeping the berm kind of clean is really important. But weeds being so adaptable and widespread and where they grow, it's kind of hard to say, well, I got that one and it's really thick out here because of what? And sometimes it turns around and it's pointing back at you because you just kind of blew it early on when there was just a little patch of it, and you let it get away from you because your management didn't change just to that issue. You didn't go mow it until it all had seeds on it. And then when you mowed it, you were just driving through this cloud of fluff that was the seeds going everywhere. So, weed control in a situation, a lot of times is just jump on it early, know what's out there or find out what's out there and come up with a plan to address it.
One that would be jumping on it late, Tom. I found it really interesting when you're talking about Johnson grass and spraying it when that grass is getting ready for fall and actually pulling all its nutrients back into the roots. Could you talk about that again?
Yeah, that goes back to, a lot of the weeds we deal with are annuals. Well, Johnson grasses and Bermuda grass are perennials. So they have a different life cycle. The annuals, like I said, their whole aim in life is I'm going to make seed. I've seen stuff 4 inches tall with seed heads on top of it. It was dry and whatever, but it's like, I'm going to make seed. Well, perennial has an option. It says, I don't have to make seed this year. So you could go out and spray Johnson grass when it was just poking out. Yeah, you'll burn it back. But if it was coming up from a rhizome, it's going to come back again. So if you understand that, yeah, I've got a bad patch of Johnson grass out there and it's been there for a few years, you know you've got a pretty good rhizome situation underneath of it. You might be a better bet is go out there in September, October, when it does have seed heads on it, because the seed heads are just done. Because now it's switched back over to I'm pulling carbohydrates and I'm putting them back down on the crown to come back again. That's the difference in a perennial versus an annual in how they're going to segment which way they're moving stuff. So they're going to be pulling stuff down. So if it's growing out, spraying it with a systemic herbicide is going to do something to it, but not a whole lot. But if it's gotten to a full grown size and says, I got all my solar panels I'm going to get, and now I'm pumping them into the crown, that would be when you would go hit it with a systemic herbicide, and it's going to pull that down and help control that crown tissue, whether it's rhizomes or crowns or whatever type of thing. So it's timing when you're going to whack it versus just going out and continuing to hit it.
So earlier is not always the best.
Earlier is not always the best, especially when you're dealing with a perennial. I just got to get some more solar panels on it before I can do much in the way of control on it.
Solar panels, I like that.
That's a good way. That's an easy, good way to think of how many, it's just like on your grapes. Right now, they don't have a whole lot of solar panels, but now when they get closer to vibration, they have almost their maximum amount of solar panels out there to make carbohydrates. Leaves, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, we actually had a number of questions. If I could interject with a couple of questions from the audience here.
Okay.
We had a number of questions about compost, and I'll review a couple of them and just kind of see what direction we want to go with that. Questions like, when is the best time to compost? What are your thoughts on the use of compost for vineyards? We talked a lot about cover crops and the benefits there, as well as using pre-emergence for weed prevention. But how about compost? Well, what can that do to help our soil health?
Compost offers a lot of things. You're bringing in life that may not be there already with the microbes that have broken down that biomass. You're bringing in nutrients because plants are made out of stuff. A lot of that's going to be carbon. And that's why the carbon to nitrogen ratio is important when you're getting that lab test on your compost. But what the plants needed, a lot of that is still there. So you're bringing in nutrients, you're bringing in life, you're bringing in carbon. Carbon is really important for the soil because it provides a food source for your microbes. It provides a um, I'm glitching on the word, but it building up the carbon in your soil allows your soil to hold on to more nutrients. I don't remember if it's negative or positively charged nutrients, but you're adding more life, you're adding more nutrients. A lot of times you're adding more water holding capacity. Com- Compost is difficult with building organic matter in the soil in California because we're so warm compared to the rest of the nation. So you want to add compost with another soil health practice if you're really trying to build up your soil organic matter with that practice. Um,
So you can't just throw it on the ground and expect it to work. It has to be accompanied with something like a cover crop or something else. Is that what I'm understanding?
You could definitely throw it on the ground and you're going to get some good benefits from it. I know of a vineyardist who uses it almost exclusively for his weed control. He just buries his berms in compost. I mean, he has to manage his vineyard a little bit more. You're still going to get benefits from compost. When it comes to California specifically, though, I wouldn't expect to see a huge rise in soil organic matter
Yeah.
from from compost alone. Same with cover crops alone.
Yeah. Your soil temperatures, your air temperatures basically mean our system is biologically active all year round. It slows
Mhm.
down a little bit in January and December, January, and February when it's cold and dark, but it's still going. So I would probably, for putting compost on versus manure. Now, manure was always brought out and dumped on the side of the field and then put on after harvest in the late fall, at least in the Fresno area where I grew up. Compost, I've seen it put on in the fall. I've seen it put on in the spring. Um, it does it, like Stetcyn pointed out. You're bringing some biology. You're bringing some life out there. So I have long advocated with okay, we'll put that on, but plant a cover crop as well, or manage whatever's growing out there, so that you have stuff helping each other on that type of thing. I wouldn't put it on in this time of year, because then it's just going to sit there and bake. And especially if you're going to put it on heavy enough to try and strangle weeds on the berm, which means you're using a diverter thrower or whatever you want to call it. You're not just throwing it everywhere. Admittedly, in a vineyard, basically what we really need, the place we really need to do the most fertility, the most benefit to our soil is the berms. And we're not necessarily doing that with cover crop. So a cover crop in the middles is going to be helping that soil health, but it's going to take a while longer basically for that to spread across the whole vineyard type of thing. The biggest thing I've seen with problem with compost is the usually the compost isn't expensive. It's getting it there, getting it put on. So it would be a soil health benefit, but I wouldn't use it by itself per se. Even if you just use your native vegetation as your cover crop, let it grow and let that root biology help out the biology you threw on top. Whether you could also put it on and turn it in if you wanted to, but then it may get ate faster and then go to sleep and stop doing its job that much faster.
Yeah, that actually brings up one of the questions that was asked a couple minutes ago. For a dry farming vineyard, is it recommended to maintain cover crops? Let's say the vineyard is young, in its third year, for example. What are the benefits to maintaining cover crops in a dry farming vineyard?
Okay, you want to be careful. So the longer you have a cover crop in the soil, the more benefits you're going to get over time. Up until the point that it starts seeding, I wouldn't want it to start reseeding itself. Dry farming, though, your water is going to be the most important and precious resource that you have. If I was managing a dry farm vineyard, I want to be crimping that cover crop. I'd say almost as it starts budding out, if the cover crop is healthy enough, because I don't want to start taking water away from the vineyard. And in California, we're not getting rains in the summer. So I'd want to switch to preservation and trying to use that cover crop as a mulch. Ah, it really depends on your area if you're trying to maintain vegetation in your dry rows during the summer in a vineyard in California, would be my opinion.
Yeah,
Tom, any thoughts on that one?
you're going to have to balance your cover crop growth with your soil moisture. Because that's all the soil moisture that's in the bank right now that the vines can reach, which would be about the top 3 feet, maybe 4, is all that those vines are going to have in a true dry farm situation. So most of the time they did about this time of year, or actually a little earlier than this, they'd go and disc it all up, and they'd make that disc layer that acted as a cap so that no more water would evaporate. Basically, the vines would have everything they could get out of it. So you're going to get some benefit out of a cover crop, but you're not going to get the maximum amount of benefit. But you're going to get some. So you had something growing out there to kind of help that water infiltration, that rainwater go in. But then you need to make sure that before the cover crop starts sucking it back out faster than it went in, you need to control it. Now, and then roller crimping or crimping, my experience basically is kind of the cover crop plants need to be at a particular stage for you to successfully do it well. If you go out at it too early, you stand the chance of it's going to spring back and grow some more. So it's kind of a fine tooth comb on that type of thing. If you had the ability to go mow it and kill it, yeah, I'd leave the mulch on top of the ground, because that's going to act like that disc layer without having to do all that tillage. It's I see cartoons in my mind when I talk about these things, and it's like, okay, the water's going in, for all of a sudden springtime and it stops raining and the cover crop starts pulling water out, and that's one of the big questions with the groundwater issues right now. Is like, is it using more than we're getting? Is a cover crop using more moisture than the benefit we're getting out of it? So those answers are coming. It's just a kind of case of we think it is, but we're not sure. So it comes down to controlling it. Your cover crop's a tool. So if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, then it's like, okay, I need to eliminate that because it's starting to be a hazard to other things.
Well, Tom Stetcyn, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I feel like we covered a lot of great resources for how we can improve our soil health. I want to give both of you just a minute for any closing thoughts. But first, before we do that, as promised, we do have a couple of prize winners I want to announce here.
Oh boy.
For the $100 Amazon gift card. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a raisin grower from Madera, California, Ron, the raisin grower from Madera, California. Thank you for joining us. You've won the $100 Amazon gift card. And the Baco pruning tool set, a wine grape grower from Arizona, Jeremiah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And we will reach out to you by email shortly to discuss delivery on that. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone else who joined us this morning to learn more about how weeds can positively and negatively impact our soil health and how we can use the knowledge that we have as a tool in knowing what to do next. Stetcyn, why don't you share for just a minute any closing thoughts you might have on the subject?
Well, I could always talk your ear off about soil health and plants. Before people start heading out, though, I did want to let everybody know about the Seeds for Bees program. It's a program that's available in California for vineyardists and farmers. Um, if you're able to receive free or subsidized cover crop seed through our program, and if you're interested in trying out cover crops, I would go to projectapusm.org and filling out the application for Seeds for Bees.
Tom, how about
Do you
you?
have any close?
Oh well, my closing remarks is basically reminding people that the grapes, the trees, the grapes, whatever, grow in the soil. So you have to have the soil, otherwise you're doing hydroponics. Soil is actually a living matrix. There's stuff floating around in there. There's bazillions of algae, lots of bacteria, lots of fungus, everything else. It's not all harmful. You got to have it. Um, Dead soil is not a whole lot of fun. You can grow stuff in it, but it's more effort than if you have something live. And then there was one other one. If you really wanted to dig into what weeds are telling you, there's a book available out there. It was written back in the 50s, but it's still useful. And it's Weeds and What They Tell Us is the title of it. And it goes through the families and all that fun stuff and what they like, what they don't like, and so on and so forth.
Project Apis M has always been a great, thank you for that plug there, been a great resource for our growers, and we look forward to it continuing to be so. And I was going to ask, you went right ahead of me there, Tom. Are there any other resources that our growers can look to as they're profiling their soils and vineyards? Where can they find more information about this?
A site that I really enjoy is called UCIPM. They break down not only just weeds, they break down a lot of pests and diseases as well, and they give you an idea of what each organism is up to, what their life cycle is, and also control measures that have been proven effective against them.
Yeah, and then it should be in every office bookcase is the UCNR Weeds of California publications, two big old thick volumes. Publication 3488. It's probably available online. It used to be the blue binder, but now it's two books. It goes through just about everything that's out there and life cycle, control measures, that type of stuff. And another one I use quite a bit for, and this one's written for the whole nation, unfortunately, but some of it still applies, is is a book called Managing Cover Crops Profitably, which was published by Sustainable Ag Network. And they don't do all the cover crops, but they do have some of those little things, and they tell you why that's not growing there. It's like, okay, it's not frost tolerant, or it's this, or it's that type of thing. And it goes through the legumes and the grasses and the small grains and all that fun stuff. So it's a valuable resource too if you're getting into cover cropping and you want to come up with these, why is that not working, or why is that working better than that?
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again, Tom and Stetcyn, for joining us this morning. And one more big shout out and thank you to Project APIS M, as well as Ag Biofusion for being our sponsor this morning. Thank you all so much for joining us, to the growers and PCAs and everyone else who joined us this morning. Thank you for choosing to spend your Friday with us. Have a great day.
Thank you much.
Thank you. See ya.